The day started like any other, calm, quiet, and full of anticipation. But deep inside, I knew this wasn't going to be just another routine day. I was about to meet a man whose presence is reshaping not only the future of his country, but also changing the way the world looks at leadership, courage, and purpose. Meeting the president of Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traore, was not just an honor. It was a journey into the heart of a revolution, a story unfolding in real time, driven by ideals stronger than fear, and rooted in the soil of Africa's proudest resistance. From the moment I arrived in Ouagadougou, the air felt different. The streets carried an energy that was hard to describe. Part tension, part hope, and something else entirely. Pride. People moved with purpose. Soldiers stood alert, not with arrogance, but with quiet determination. Every corner I turned reminded me that this wasn't just a country going through change. It was a people reclaiming their voice. And at the center of it all was one man, Ibrahim Traore, young, fearless, and often misunderstood. He's not the kind of president you see in suits and ceremonial parades. He's the kind you see in boots, out in the sun, walking beside his people. When I got the confirmation that I'd be meeting him, my heart raced, not from nerves, but from the weight of what this moment meant. Here was a leader who rose, not through politics, but through sacrifice. A military captain who chose his people over personal gain. Some call him controversial, others call him a hero, but no one can deny he is changing the story of Burkina Faso. As I entered the compound where the meeting was scheduled, I was struck by how grounded everything felt. No over-the-top security, no unnecessary extravagance, just discipline, calm, and a sense of order. The guards greeted me respectfully. I noticed a young boy standing nearby, holding a small flag of Burkina Faso. His eyes were filled with admiration, not for a celebrity or an athlete, but for his president. That moment stuck with me. We were led into a room that felt more like a strategy center than a political office. Maps, books, and folders lined the walls. And then he walked in. Captain Ibrahim Traore, tall, focused, and completely unshaken by cameras or attention. There was no delay. He reached out his hand, firm and warm, and said in a calm voice, "Welcome to Burkina Faso." It's hard to describe what it feels like to be in the presence of someone who carries the hopes of millions on his shoulders. There was no pretension in his voice, no scripted smiles, just sincerity. As we sat down, he didn't start with formalities. Instead, he asked me, "What do people outside know about us?" That one question opened up an entire conversation, not just about politics or power, but about truth. Traore spoke with honesty. He didn't paint his country as perfect. He didn't pretend everything was under control. But what stood out was how deeply he believed in the strength of his people. He talked about farmers, soldiers, mothers, and students. Everyday citizens standing against terrorism, corruption, and external pressure. He spoke of rebuilding education, reclaiming the land, and bringing back dignity to a country that had suffered in silence for too long. But behind his calm tone, I could feel the storm he faces daily. Burkina Faso is not just fighting terrorism. It's resisting a legacy of exploitation. And as Traore explained the challenges they face, from blocked aid to media misinformation, it became clear that his battle wasn't just on the ground. It was also against perception. He doesn't want pity for his country. He wants partnership. He doesn't seek handouts. He wants respect. As the conversation deepened, I asked him what keeps him going. What gives him strength on the hardest days? He looked at me and said, "I was a soldier before I was a president. I never planned this, But when your people cry for help, you don't turn your back. You stand up, or you become part of the problem. Those words hung in the air. And suddenly, the image the world had painted of him, angry, militant, reckless, started to crack. In front of me wasn't a man chasing power, but someone carrying a responsibility he never asked for, but couldn't ignore. There's something powerful about that kind of leadership. Raw, real, and unfiltered. Before I could ask my next question, one of his aides entered the room and whispered something in his ear. He nodded and stood up. "We'll continue," he said, "but there's something I need to attend to." I followed him to the balcony, where a small group of school children had gathered below. He waved to them, not as a politician, but as someone who saw his younger self in them. Then he turned back to me and said something I'll never forget. "They are why I do this. Every child here deserves a country where they don't grow up in fear." And that's when I realized this meeting was more than just a political conversation. It was a look into the soul of a nation in the making. A leader who doesn't hide behind power, but walks with purpose. A country that refuses to be defined by its pain, but by its potential. But just as we were about to dive into the deeper parts of our discussion, talks about international pressure, internal reforms, and the real cost of independence, the mood in the room shifted. A phone rang. A short exchange followed. The aide's face turned serious. Captain Traore looked at me and said, "We'll have to pause here." There was no fear in his voice, but something was clearly happening, something urgent. He stood up, shook my hand again, and with a firm but steady tone said, "You've seen our spirit, but now you'll see what we're really up against." And just like that, he was gone. Into another room, onto another mission, carrying the weight of a nation once again. What happened next is something I didn't expect, and it changed everything. The silence after he left the room felt heavy. I stood there for a moment, trying to understand what had just happened. A few seconds ago, I was sitting across from one of Africa's most talked about presidents, diving into the soul of a nation. Now, I was alone in a room where history seemed to pause. I looked out over the balcony again. The children were still there, still waving their flags, still smiling, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that something important was unfolding just beyond the walls I stood in. An aide walked in quietly and asked if I would like some tea while I waited. I nodded. His face was polite but unreadable. A practiced calmness that hinted he had seen situations like this before. As I sipped the tea, I glanced around the room. The walls were filled with portraits, leaders, revolutionaries, soldiers who had fought for Burkina Faso's independence. I could almost feel them watching, as if reminding me that this land was no stranger to struggle. Half an hour passed, then an hour, and I realized this wasn't just a short interruption. Whatever pulled Captain Ibrahim Traore away was serious. That's when another official entered, this time inviting me to a briefing room. "You'll want to see this," he said. I followed, unsure what to expect. Inside, a small group had gathered around a large screen. Maps were being updated in real time. A red zone flickered in the northern region of the country. The mood was tense. One of the military officers explained that a village near the border had come under attack. Armed groups, likely terrorists, had struck suddenly and without warning. It wasn't just a threat, it was an active crisis. My heart sank. This was the reality of Burkina Faso. While cities buzzed with life, the outer regions lived in a constant state of alert. Terrorism wasn't just a news headline here. It was a daily haunting truth. Families forced to flee, schools burned, lives taken without reason. And yet, in all of this, the people had not given up. They still believed change was possible. What I saw next brought it all into focus. A live drone feed showed Captain Traore himself boarding a helicopter. He wasn't just sending orders from the capital, he was flying straight into the danger zone. No protective wall between him and the front lines. No distance from his people's pain. He had once said, leadership means showing up, and now he was proving it again. That moment hit me hard. I thought about the difference between words and action, between titles and truth. Many leaders speak of sacrifice, few live it. As the situation unfolded, I stayed close to the media team. They gave me more context. The region under attack had been targeted multiple times before. It was rich in natural resources, and that made it a magnet for exploitation. Armed groups, some with foreign backing, tried to claim the land through fear. But the people refused to leave. They stood their ground, and that resistance made them a target again and again. Burkina Faso's conflict isn't just about territory. It's about identity. It's about whether a nation can build its future without external interference, whether it can rise from years of colonial legacy and modern manipulation. And at the heart of this fight is a man who sees no other option but to resist, even if it costs him everything. While the main story centered on the attack, there were smaller stories unfolding too, each one revealing another layer of the struggle. I met a young woman named Aisha, a teacher who had been evacuated from the north. She told me how her school had been closed for over a year due to violence, but she continued to teach under a tree, using charcoal on broken tiles as blackboards. If we stop teaching, she said, they win. Ignorance is what they want. I spoke with a soldier too, barely 22 years old, who had just returned from a mission. He didn't talk about war the way movies do. There was no pride in his voice, just a quiet fatigue. But there was also clarity. We're not fighting for land, he said. We're fighting so our families can sleep. Each story added weight to the bigger picture. This wasn't just a country dealing with crisis. It was a country refusing to surrender. Hours passed, and finally word came through. Captain Traore was returning to the capital. The situation had been controlled. The attackers repelled. Losses had occurred. But the village stood strong. As his convoy approached, a small crowd had gathered outside the main gates. No fanfare, no speeches, just citizens wanting to shake his hand, to say thank you, to feel seen. I watched from a distance as he stepped out of the vehicle, covered in dust, his expression unreadable, but the moment his eyes met the people's, something softened. Boy ran up and saluted him. He knelt, returned the salute, and whispered something in the child's ear. The boy smiled wide. In that simple gesture, you could feel what this leadership meant. Later, when we met again, there was a moment of silence. He looked tired, but not broken. You see now, he said. This is what we live every day, and yet we continue. I asked him how he kept hope alive when the world often looked the other way. He paused, then said, because the people still believe. That's all I need. And just when I thought our story was reaching its peak, something else happened. A piece of intelligence arrived, suggesting that the recent attack may not have been just another raid. There was evidence of coordination, of deeper political motives, possibly even foreign influence, aiming to destabilize the region. Before an important announcement from the government, what was this plan? Why now? The tension returned, heavier than before. Captain Traore's eyes narrowed. If that's true, he said, then we're fighting something much bigger than terrorism. And just like that, the stakes changed. Now the question wasn't just how to defend the country. It was, who really wants it to fall, and why? That answer, I would come to learn, was more dangerous than anyone imagined. As the sun began to set over Ouagadougou, a different kind of darkness settled over the capital. one that couldn't be seen, only felt. Inside the presidential compound, the mood had shifted. The room that once buzzed with plans for education, agriculture, and cultural exchange was now filled with hushed voices and guarded glances. The report that had just arrived wasn't just troubling, it was explosive. There were whispers of foreign operatives, secret communications, and paid proxies embedded within the country, not just to destabilize a region, but to tear apart the leadership from within. Captain Ibrahim Traore didn't speak for a long time. He sat quietly, staring at the file in front of him. Then, with a calm voice, he said, "We always knew they wouldn't stop at bullets. Now they're using shadows." The information pointed to a well-orchestrated plan, one that aimed to shake public trust, divide military leadership, and cripple economic agreements being formed between Burkina Faso and countries like Russia. The recent attack on the village wasn't random. It was a message. But who was behind it? And why now? That night, I was allowed to sit in on a confidential strategic meeting. It was intense, raw, emotional, and at times painful to watch. The country was stretched thin. Some ministers feared a political coup. Others believed certain allies might no longer be trustworthy. But through it all, Ibrahim Traore stood firm. "If we lose our focus now," he said, "they win without." A single bullet. Then came a surprising twist. A call came in from a journalist in the Sahel region, someone who had been tracking rebel movements for months. He had intercepted a coded message between two high-profile individuals, one of them a known arms dealer, the other a former advisor to a neighboring government. The message spoke clearly. Delay their progress. Stop the Russian agreements. Discredit Traore before the next summit. That was the final piece of the puzzle. It wasn't just Burkina Faso that was being targeted. It was the growing unity between African nations and Russia, the independence from Western-controlled systems, the desire to choose their own path. These new partnerships, based on respect, mutual benefit, and dignity, were seen as a threat by those who benefited from chaos. But Captain Traore didn't panic. Instead, he chose to do something unexpected. The next day, he called a press conference, not to expose names, not to accuse countries, but to speak directly to the people of Burkina Faso. And what he said that day will stay with me forever. He stood in front of the cameras, in a simple khaki uniform, and said, "There are those who fear our freedom, who fear our strength. But we are not alone, we are not broken, and we are not afraid. The future of Burkina Faso will not be written in secret meetings or by those who sell fear. It will be written by our teachers, our farmers, our youth, our soldiers, and every citizen who refuses to give up." The crowd outside the palace began to cheer. It grew louder, stronger, until the streets were filled with people holding signs of unity. Children chanted his name. Elders wept quietly. For the first time in a long time, there was no fear in their eyes, only pride. Over the following weeks, reforms were strengthened. Investigations were launched quietly. Those who were working against the nation's interest were removed from power without violence or spectacle. Burkina Faso's partnerships with Russia continued, now even stronger, with more students receiving scholarships, more joint agricultural projects being launched, and a serious commitment to building industries within Africa, for Africa, before I left the country. I had one last conversation with Captain Traore. He walked me through the Mandela Institute again, showing me new classrooms, a small library being built, and a wall where students had painted their dreams. He pointed to one mural, a group of children standing under the Burkinabe flag, surrounded by books, tractors, and computers. This, he said with a smile, is why we fight. And in that moment, I understood something deeper than politics or diplomacy. This wasn't just about Burkina Faso. This was about the right of any people, anywhere in the world, to stand tall, to dream freely, and to write their own story, without being told they're too small, too poor, or too weak. As my plane lifted off from Ouagadougou Airport, I looked down one last time at the city below. I thought of the children waving flags, of Aisha teaching under a tree, of young soldiers standing guard, not for power, but for peace. The world may not always understand what is happening here, but I do now, and I'll never forget it. If this story moved you, remember, sometimes the most powerful revolutions aren't the ones with noise and fire. They're the quiet ones, written in the hearts of people who simply refuse to give up. Thank you for watching.